Hey everyone, it's Ladine from Sugar Stitches Quilt Co. I have been having so much fun learning the features and the power behind my new Baby Lock Ballad sewing machine. I thought this would be the perfect time to do a video tutorial series on the most requested topic, quilt binding. So I'm so excited to offer you this 3-part series on quilt binding with your machine. In this video, we'll be diving into the basics of quilt binding and the most common questions and problems that I have seen and heard and personally experienced with quilt binding. In my second part to the video series, I'll be showing you how I personally have learned the best tips and tricks on binding my quilts and the process that I use. And then in the third part of the series, I'm going to show you some really fun tricks that I've learned about using decorative stitching and different types of binding to really highlight your projects. And don't be intimidated because they're easy. With just a little practice, you can master them as well too. If you like what you see in this video series, then do me a favor and give me a thumbs up so that I know that I'm providing you the best content that I can provide you. And also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you can receive all of the updates when I upload new videos. Whether you're a seasoned quilter or just starting out, quilt binding is a topic that we can all use new tips and suggestions to learn from. And I would love it if you drop me a comment and let me know, did you find this video helpful or do you have other questions? And also, if I didn't mention a tip that you have that's really helped you with your quilt binding, then leave it below for the quilting community to read as well. Enough chit chat for today. Let's get started with quilt binding and the most common questions and problems that we see in quilting. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's clarify what quilt binding is. Quilt binding is the fabric strip that surrounds the outer edges of the quilt, giving it a finished and polished look. There are several sizes of binding, ways to cut binding, ways to create your binding, and even ways to attach your binding. In this series, we won't be covering all aspects of quilt binding, but we will be covering several areas to help you give your quilts that beautiful finished look. You may have also heard of the term bias binding. This is simply binding that has been cut on the bias so that the fabric has a stretchier finish, as you can see, than strips that haven't been cut on the bias. Bias binding is particularly useful in bag making or when you have rounded edges on your quilted project. Otherwise, it's not necessary for binding a regular quilt. One important decision that you need to make before binding your quilt is what width you want for your quilt binding. A common measurement is 2.5 inches, but some quilters prefer 2.25 or even a larger 2.75 or 3-inch binding. To be honest, there is no magic perfect size for quilt binding every time. It really depends on the look that you want for your quilt, how much of the binding you want to show on your quilt, and also how thick your quilt sandwich is. For example, if you're using a very thick batting, chances are you wouldn't want to use a 2.25-inch binding because you wouldn't have enough to pull to the front to cover the edges of your quilt and have enough to stitch down. As a general rule, 2.5-inch quilt binding is sufficient not only for the look around your quilt, but ensuring you have enough fabric to fold and properly stitch. Remember, when we reference the width of the quilt binding, this is how wide the strips will be. Typically, the length of your binding strips will be the length of your fabric. So for example, if you are starting with yardage, your strips will be the length between your two selvages, typically between 42 to 43 inches long. The width will be your decision in how wide you want to cut those strips. Sometimes when you see a particular print of fabric, it's so beautiful that you want to use it. However, you'll need to make sure that the print of your fabric will look good once it's folded into your binding. You wouldn't want to choose a large print and then by the time you fold it and sew it, you've lost the overall look and feel of the print. Of course, stripes are always a good choice, and I also love making scrappy binding, where you can either use scraps or you can do what I've done in this case, which is use the leftover fabric from my project to create different colored strips within the binding that match my quilt top. I would also encourage you to think about whether you want your binding to blend with your quilt or be an accent to the front of the quilt. If I'm using a particular fabric collection, then I usually like to pick one that I know will work well as the binding. For example, with this plaid print. As a general rule, to calculate how much quilt binding you will need for your project, measure each of the four sides of your quilt and then add them together. Then add approximately 20 inches to your total. This should give you plenty of binding for your project. To calculate the amount of width of fabric strips you need, simply divide your width of fabric, typically 42 inches, by your overall amount of binding needed. Here's a little secret though. It's even easier to use online calculators. My favorite is the Robert Kaufman and Quilter's Paradise calculators. I have the app on my phone and I just simply pull that out when I need to calculate binding, even when I'm writing quilt patterns. It will calculate both regular and bias binding. You simply enter your width of fabric strips. Mine is 42. I'd like my binding strips to be 2.5. And just say, for example, my quilt is 60 inches wide by 60 inches long. You can see you can choose regular binding or bias binding and then calculate. And then it tells you the total length of binding that you'll need, the strips that you need to cut, and the yardage that you need. I mentioned earlier about cutting the width and the length of your binding, but let's take a look at a piece of fabric to better understand. I have a half yard of this fabric for binding on a wall hanging that I'm making. As I mentioned, from selvage to selvage is the length of our binding. You don't need to worry about removing the selvages first because we will take care of that and work around them. My project is 25 inches by 25 inches. As I mentioned, it's a wall hanging. So I will need to cut 3 strips of binding from my fabric. And I will use 2.5-inch wide strips. Now, if you know me or have followed me for any amount of time, you know that I love to starch my fabrics before piecing a quilt. However, I typically do not starch my binding. In my opinion, it makes it too stiff to work with and to fold around the corners, but I do like to iron my fabric to get any wrinkles out before cutting. And once I've done that, I like to keep the fold where the fabric has come off of the bolt. So I will typically iron my fabric in half when I'm using yardage, iron it, and then fold it back the way that it came off of the bolt. And I have found that that tends to make my binding strips more even and easier to cut. Depending on which type of ruler you are using, or if you have less space, you can also fold your fabric in half again. Just make sure to watch your measurements as you cut in case your fabrics start to shift. You are cutting through 4 layers of fabric, which typically isn't a problem as long as you're cutting with a fresh blade and you're using a proper ruler and proper cutting techniques. Now, when I'm cutting my binding, I do like to make sure that I cut one edge so that I know I have a clean edge to start with, and then you can cut your strips. A long ruler like the Creative Grids 6.5 by 24.5-inch ruler works really well so that as soon as you cut your clean edge, then you can just find your 2.5-inch mark and line that up with your clean edge, cut your binding strip, I like to move that one out of the way, line it up again with the lines on my ruler, not my cutting mat because the ruler is more accurate, cut another strip, and then continue on. I'm going to show you what I love to cut my binding with though instead. And that is my stripology ruler. I love the stripology ruler. It makes things so simple. And with cutting binding, you can see that there is a symbol for 2.5-inch cuts. It's the little small square. And so you just simply find those squares. You really don't need to pay attention to measuring anything on a ruler. You just simply follow the little small squares. And I love using the stripology because I can simply place it on my fabric that I know I have folded properly, and I line up this line down at the bottom, and it's on the folded edge of my fabric. Once that is lined up on the bottom with the folded edge of my fabric, I like to cut on the 0 here to create that clean line that I was referring to. And just simply hold the ruler, watch your fingers, and cut. And I don't typically move this ruler once I've laid it down. I find that once you pick it up, your fabric strips can move and shift, and we don't want that. So I just leave it there, making sure that I'm holding the ruler firm with each cut. And then as I mentioned, we just simply find the small square in each slot, and we know that we're cutting 2.5-inch strips. Remember, I only need 3 for this project. So I hold onto the ruler. I like to make sure that I'm on the right slot and cut. Then again, moving to the 5, cut, and then the next square and cut. And that's all I need for this wall hanging. So then I'll pick up my ruler, and then you can see we had the little strip that we would have no matter which ruler we use, because that's just our waste from cleaning that one edge. And I have 1, 2, 3 strips of binding, and then this is my leftover yardage that I'll put to the side. And now we have our binding strips ready to make our binding. To reduce bulk and help the fabric blend better, the best way to connect your strips of binding is on the diagonal, and then press your seams open. Let me show you how I do that. I'm going to start with just 2 strips to show you how to join the ends together. We need to place 2 of our fabric strips right sides together at a 90-degree angle. Remember, I mentioned you didn't need to worry about removing your selvage ends, and this is why. We can overlap them just a little bit further to make sure that when we trim the binding off, that we're trimming those. So just make sure that it extends past your binding, and they'll be trimmed off as waste. So we're placing these 2 fabric strips right sides together at a 90-degree angle. You'll be sewing them on a 45-degree angle from corner to corner across the diagonal. If you'd like, at this point, you can just simply pin and take it over your sewing machine and eyeball the line across. Or sometimes it helps me to mark those lines, and you can do the same. Now these lines will be your sewing lines, so you can use a fabric pen or a pencil. Once you've laid your strips down in the 90 degrees, I just place the ruler on the diagonal, making sure you're hitting both of these corners. That's the most important area, are the intersections here in the diagonal. And just line the ruler up there and mark. And then I like to place a pin. It doesn't matter where you place your pin, just so that you're holding your fabric strips together so they don't get twisted in any way. And then to avoid getting confused or flipping your fabric the wrong way, I just simply move my fabric, and you can see I know I'm going to be sewing the right direction because I have my fabrics matching together when I open them up. And then I just go down to the next end, take my next fabric strip, and there's a selvage there, and I'm just going to extend that, placing them together, right sides together at a 90-degree angle. And then I'm going to mark the 45-degree angle diagonal. and then pin. Might not be able to see that pink line as much, but you see it goes from corner to corner. And marking the line is not necessary at all. If you are good and able to take these over to the sewing machine and eyeball that diagonal line as I mentioned, then you can do that. Or if it works better for you, you can mark the line. I like to prepare all of my strips and then take them over to the sewing machine, but you can certainly do all of this at your machine. Because we are sewing on the diagonal and we'll be pressing the seams open on our binding strips, I like to reduce my stitch length a little bit, either 1.5 to 1.8, to really hold them together and strengthen the seams and to make sure that no seams open as we're working with the binding. Okay, and here we are at my sewing machine, and I have my diagonal lines here that we marked, and I like to just make sure that nothing shifted, and I still have my pin there that I will just remove as I'm sewing. And I like to put my needle down first, and that way I can make sure that the corner is nested nicely with the needle down, ready for me to sew. And then we'll just sew on the diagonal line. And then I get my next intersection that we marked, and my needle is still down. I haven't cut my threads, and I just chain piece these together, and we'll cut the excess fabric off and our threads all at the same time. And then you would continue with all of your binding strips. I only have 2, so I'm going to go ahead and cut my threads. And there you can see I have my strips sewn together. If you want to double check them before you make any cuts, you can do so. Open those up. I decided not to try to match my lines together on this binding because I don't think it's going to matter on the wall hanging, but if you wanted to, you could certainly do that before you stitch them together. So now let's go over to my pressing station, and I'm going to show you how I trim and press these open. So as I mentioned, I like to make sure and open my strips up before I make any cuts. I like to go ahead and cut the thread in between each strip. We want to trim approximately 1/4 of an inch away from our sewn line. It does not need to be extremely accurate with a ruler because we've already sewn our line. So you can simply do this with scissors if you'd like. It makes it much easier. And then cut the little dog ears off if you have any. And then there you have your binding strip. And then I'll do the same on the next section. And there we go. And then our next step is to press these seams open. And pressing them open is important to reduce the bulk in your quilt. That's why I like to reduce my stitch length to make sure that the seams are strong and there's no issues with them coming open. I like to just press my iron down. I don't like to move it back and forth when I'm doing this. And you can see we have a nice flat seam. I'll just lay my tailor's clapper there to flatten that seam even more. Now the next step that I take in assembling my quilt binding is to fold the binding strip in half and press this before I attach it to my quilt. So another question I get quite often is, do I have to fold and iron ahead of time? And let me just say, for the most part, pre-pressing your binding strips is a smart move. You'll simply fold them in half. This helps crease and make it easier to handle during the sewing process once you're at your machine. There are several notions out there to make the process even quicker that actually hold the binding while you move your iron. Sometimes quilters don't like to take that extra step. There are also ways of attaching the binding to your quilt without pressing in half first. Some quilters prefer to attach the open binding strips like this to the quilt and then fold. However, as I mentioned, if you're binding on a full quilt, ironing first just makes the attachment process easier in my opinion. If you're making a small project, then it may not be necessary, but again, it's purely your decision. And now that we have pressed our seam, our diagonal seam open, we would just start pressing this in half as I mentioned. Raw edges together. And you just simply go down your binding strips. And this is what some people don't enjoy, because if you're making a lot of binding, it can be time consuming. but as I mentioned, I like to because I think it's less to fuss with at my sewing machine. So if you haven't already noticed, there isn't one perfect way to bind a quilt, and that theme continues through the entire process. Attaching the binding to your quilt is another area where there are different options, and it's really a matter of preference. First, you could attach your binding to the front of your quilt with the raw edges lined up with the raw edges of your quilt, and then after sewing, you would be pulling to the back and then attaching by stitching in the ditch on the front. You may choose this method if you don't want to see any stitch lines on the front of your binding on your quilt. You'll just need to make sure that you're properly stitching in the ditch or hand sewing and that you are matching your threads appropriately. Although I normally would recommend you use your walking foot for binding, if you do decide to use this method where you do have to stitch in the ditch, having a stitch in the ditch foot for your sewing machine or something similar may really help you make sure that you're getting it in the right spot. Otherwise, you can sew too far, which will end up either on your binding or on the quilt top, and that's not what we want. Many quilters choose this method because they like the finished look of the binding. However, keep in mind that you're sewing blindly here. Wonder clips will be your friend to hold the binding in place until you get to that area, then remove the clips as you sew. As you stop when you are readjusting, I recommend that you take a look, make sure you're catching the binding on the back. If you find any spots were missed, you'll need to readjust and re-sew over those areas. When you get to the corners, you'll want to make sure that everything is still folded correctly. When you get to your corners, you'll want to make sure that everything is still folded correctly. Sew all the way to the corner, stop with your needle down, pivot your quilt, and then continue sewing down the next side. The second method is to attach the binding to the back of the quilt and then pull to the front and stitch your binding down. You sew the binding down and fold your corners the exact same as in the first method, but you'll be finishing your binding by sewing along the edge about 1/8 of an inch away to the right of the binding to secure the binding down. This is typically how I attach my binding, and I'll be demonstrating my full process in the second video of this binding series. This method also gives you the option of using decorative stitches by hand or with your machine, and I'll be showing you examples of that in the third video in this binding series. Since your stitching will show on the front of the binding in this method, choose the thread color that you want to either be a contrast to the binding or to blend with your binding. And then your bobbin thread should match your backing. And the third method you could use is a self-binding technique, where your backing fabric is actually cut larger than the front, so it can be folded around to the front and secured. There is no separate binding that needs to be made. You may have seen this method used with different types of fabric for a fun look. It can also be very efficient. You would want to make sure that you're choosing a backing fabric that you would also want as your binding fabric. Now, no matter if you're using the first or second option to bind your quilt, you always want to start by leaving a tail of about 6 to 8 inches at the beginning before you start attaching your binding to your quilt. I like to start at the bottom of my quilt near the middle. You will align the raw edges of the binding with the raw edges of your quilt and secure it with clips or pins. Begin sewing using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and stop approximately 1/4 of an inch away from the first corner and then continue around. Don't worry though, I'm going to show you each of these steps in more detail because you guessed it, those are some of the most frequently asked questions that I receive about binding, are the corners and then also how to join our ends when we're finished sewing the binding to our quilt. Now I want to show you a super easy way to start and stop and join your binding ends. We need to start here first with our binding strip. This is my binding strip that I had already pressed in half, and I just open up one of the edges, and we are going to be cutting on the diagonal in this direction. If you want to mark that, you can to make sure that it's accurate. I'm just going to measure a 45-degree line that we're actually going to cut on. The marking wasn't necessary. I just wanted to be able to show you that we need to make sure that that angle is accurate. And then I just make that cut. So now instead of our binding ending being square, we have it at an angle. And you can see when we fold it back over, this is what it looks like. Now we have a raw edge here. So what I like to do is fold this over a little over about 1/4 of an inch or so. And then just give that a good press. And then I like to fold my binding over again and press that middle crease for my raw edges. And you can see now we're just left with a little bit of a overlap in that binding area. It may look strange, but stay with me. And then we also have a little dog ear here that we can trim off. Okay, and there we go. Now let's take this over to my wall hanging that I'm using, and I'm going to show you what we're doing with this. The great thing about this trick of how to start and end your binding is that when we come to the end and you have your binding tail left, you simply tuck it in and continue stitching down. And you're left with a nice ending to your binding that you didn't have to measure and cut. First, I will actually start stitching my binding down here in this corner because I want this area to be secure as I'm working on the binding. But I'm only going to stitch a short amount, and then I'm going to cut my threads and then pick up down here, stitching around the rest of my project. We want to leave this portion unsewn for right now so that we have the room to push the end of the binding when we're finishing everything up. So I'll line that raw edge up and then start sewing. And I'm using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And then I like to back stitch 1 or 2, secure that, and then cut my threads. Okay, and you can see we just have this little section here where we've tacked this down. And now let's move a little further up on our binding, just a few inches we're going to leave open, and then start attaching our binding here as we normally would. Now I like to use a quilting glove, and strangely enough, I only do it on my left hand so that I can get a proper grip on my quilt. I feel like I have better control here. You may not necessarily need this. And then we're going to start attaching our binding. Okay, and now I am coming around to finishing my binding. And you can see there was this where we started our binding and stitch this little section down. And all we will be doing is tucking this portion of the binding inside. I like to trim my binding at an angle and give myself just a little bit of room past where this will be stitched, just so we have a little bit of overlap here. It doesn't need to be precise. And then just trim that there. And then now you see we have just this little small tail that will tuck inside. I'm going to take this glove off. We're going to tuck inside here. And if you need to trim these edges, or if you feel like it's not trimmed enough, you can do that too. I'm going to cut a little bit more off. And then you just tuck it in nicely. Take your time and be patient. We want to make sure that we don't have any gaps or extra fabric areas, just like we do when we're joining the binding edges in the traditional way. And get that in there just right. Everything's laying nice and flat. And then now we just continue sewing everything closed. Now you do have a little bit of bulk here in this area, But if you're making something like a wall hanging where this won't get any use, then it's probably not going to be a problem. If you have a quilt that you're using, you may not want to use this method. Some people like it no matter what project they're doing because it's just so simple. And you are stitching your edges. There's no raw edges, so you shouldn't have any problems doing this method versus the other method. And it sure is easier because you're just tucking it in there and everything is nice and flat and straight. And we didn't have to worry about the typical problems you do when trimming binding ends and sewing them together at the end. So now I'm just going to continue sewing my binding to where I began. Just want to make sure that everything is in there. If you need to raise your presser foot before you get into that second area there, and then continue. And I'm going to back stitch just a little bit, secure that stitch, and then cut. And then now you can see we have our binding that we will press to the front and then continue sewing. So it was so much easier than the traditional way. So this is a great option for you if you'd like. Let's talk about how to join our binding endings. And this was probably the biggest struggle that I had when I first started quilting, and sometimes I never even understood what I did wrong. Sometimes I would twist my binding, I wouldn't cut it accurately. No matter what, it never ended up laying flat and nice, and I always ended up with puckers or just being completely off and miscutting. So let's take care of those common misconceptions and misunderstandings today. So I have just a little small quilt sandwich that I made for this demonstration, and you can see that I've attached my binding. It doesn't matter if you've attached your binding to the back or to the front first. Joining of the ends will be the same. I like to leave a good distance between the two endings where I have started my stitching and ended. On a larger quilt, I probably would have left a larger area. Because this was a small project, I have a little bit of a smaller space, but I wanted you to be able to see exactly what it is that I'm doing here. We left a tail when we began our quilting. And then, of course, we have our leftover binding when we end our quilting. And you may find that you have a lot of extra binding that can sometimes just get in the way. So I like to trim this, but I always want to make sure that when I'm trimming, I'm not trimming any areas that I might need to help me later in the process. So for example, this piece is a little bit longer than I'd like to work with right now. So I'm going to cut it just in this area here because I know that my overlap and join will be here. So I do have some extra. And then in this area, I know I'm not going to need this area down in this section, so I can trim off some of this extra there as well. And again, that's just extra to get out of the way. But we will keep one of those pieces to help us in our measuring. Now I cut my binding 2.5 inches wide. So if I open up this little section of binding that I just trimmed off, this measures 2.5 inches wide. The overlap of your two binding strips needs to equal the size of your binding strips. So I used 2.5 inch binding strips. So my overlap of these two ends needs to be 2.5 inches. And it's handy to be able to use the small piece of fabric left over as a measuring guide. If you don't want to do that, then you are more than welcome to get a ruler out as well. I have a small 2.5 inch ruler that I can show you with as well. And like I said, either one, it's up to you, whatever you feel most comfortable with. So we'll pick where we want our binding ends to join together. There is no particular area that you need to choose, but I would encourage you to stay away from any joined strips that you may have along any of these areas because it will end up being more bulk and a little bit harder to work with. I don't have that problem, so it doesn't really matter where I join my ends. And also, don't be afraid if you find that as you're working with these ends, trying to join them, if you don't have enough room, then just unstitch some of these stitches here in this area to give you more room to work with so that you're comfortable. So the first thing we're going to do is to trim our binding edges to where we want that joining space to be. I want mine around this particular area just because of the room that I have. So I'm going to trim this first binding strip. And then I'll lay it flat down on my quilt. And then this is where the measuring tool comes in, whether it's your binding strip or a ruler. You're going to lay that against the raw edge of this binding strip that you just cut. And then we'll take our second binding strip and we want to lay that flat. Don't pull or anything else, just lay it flat on top of your measuring tool. And we will be cutting the second binding strip on the left side. Okay, so we have, this is our overlap, and we want the overlap, remember, to be the same size as our binding. So don't cut it here. You'll need to cut it on this side so that the strips are overlapping. And again, don't pull. And then make your cut right there. Okay, and then we can move the ruler out of the way and move our extra binding. And now we have our two tails that have overlapped 2.5 inches, and this is where we need to join those. Now, when you're working with a larger quilt, sometimes it helps to fold the quilt in this area so that you can give yourself some extra room to work with those strips. Then put a wonder clip there. This is a smaller project, but I'm still doing it to make sure we have enough to be able to see. I'm actually going to move this up here. And I can already tell that I don't have enough room to work with, so I'm going to unpick just a few of my stitches here. And that's just to give myself some extra room. Okay, I've zoomed in a little closer so we can talk about joining these binding ends. Now, the most common problem that I hear with joining of the binding ends after we've trimmed is getting them turned around or twisted that they're not facing the right direction. So I like to start on one side. We'll start on our right side. And as the binding is coming off of the sewn area, we haven't turned it, twisted it, anything. Just simply open up the binding and then place that right sides up flat on your workstation. And then you'll take your next section. Again, don't twist anything. It's coming off of your sewn area. Open that up and then just turn it and place it right sides down on top of your first strip to form that perpendicular strip that looks really familiar from when we were joining our binding strips before we sewed them together. And you'll just line up those raw edges, and then we will be sewing the diagonal line from corner to corner here. And I used to always get confused about this too, trying to sew here, which direction do I sew? It's easier if you have everything laid out that you can remember it's a horizontal line across in front of you. Raw edges are lined up and everything is straight. Now at this point you could just pin and take it to your sewing machine and sew that diagonal line from corner to corner, or you can get your ruler, lay that down and mark that line as well. I like to mark my lines, so that's what we're going to do. And there's no overlap or anything here like you may have done with your binding strips initially. So don't make that mistake, because then your binding strips will not be the proper size that they need to be. I just like to peek in there and make sure that I'm on my corners. Mark that line, and then I'll pin. So this is where we have to be a little bit more accurate, but there's nothing to worry about. We've trimmed our binding strips, we know confidently, to the right size here. So we just need to make sure that this joining of the two strips, we're even on the raw edges, and then we have our diagonal line. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, sew this line, and I'll come back. Okay, I am back from the sewing machine, and you can see that I have my sewn line, and the first thing we want to do, we'll take this clip out, open our quilt back up. We want to make sure that our binding strip is, first of all, not twisted, and that there isn't any gap or anything like that. Of course, it looks funny right now because we haven't trimmed, but before we trim, we want to make sure that everything is good to go. Don't trim until you know that everything is good. So I am really happy with how this turned out. So I'm going to open this back up. This is our overlap. Don't cut on the inside of your binding. We'll just trim approximately 1/4 of an inch there on our binding. And then what I like to do is just finger press. You can also take it over to the iron if you need to. Finger press that and then lay it back down. And everything should be nice and flat. No gaps here or anything like that. Should be nice and flat to be able to sew down to your quilt. And mine looks great. So at this point, you would just take it back over to your sewing machine, start on one side where you ended your stitching, and sew down to the next section. I'm actually going to, this isn't laying as flat as I would like, so I'm going to press that first, press it down, and then I'm going to close this area up, and I'll be back to show you the end result. Okay, and now I'm back from the sewing machine, and you can see where I closed everything up, and it looks great. And so now I have my project with my binding ends ready to finish. Okay, now let's talk about getting those nice crisp mitered corners. And I have two things that I believe are my trick to nice mitered corners. The first is what I showed you before about making sure that you get those 1/4 of an inch seams just in the right point. So we have a great miter on this one side, but we need to take care of the back. And that's where my second secret comes in. And I really like pressing. I really feel that pressing makes a big difference in mitering my corners. If you watched my second video, then you know that I also like to glue base my binding, which you can see I've already done on the side. If you don't like to glue base, that's okay, but I would encourage you to go ahead and press, and if you're going to use Wonder Clips or pens, whatever it is you do to hold the sides of your binding together, do that first and then leave all 4 corners open and do the corners last. And that's because we're actually going to fold them like a little present. Now, the reason that I mentioned the ironing is one of the keys to the crispness of my corners is because as we're working with this, you can see that, you know, the fabric just wants to basically do what it wants to do. And I feel like pressing puts it in an exact place of where we want it, and it gives it that crisp texture for us to be able to fold those corners. I like to also think about mitering these corners on the second side as folding a piece of paper, essentially. So I like to take one end, and I'll actually put my finger in here to pull this tight, and then you can see that we have this nice corner here that's starting to form. That's what I want to press and hold in place. And you just need a few seconds there to crease your fabric. And then you can move that. Cut some of these strings. And then the second piece of fabric, you're going to fold down and make that miter. Now you can see that that miter looks pretty good for the first time. So I would normally just set that with the iron. And then now it's exactly in place. I can place a Wonder Clip there, and then now I can take it over to my sewing machine, start sewing my binding down, and this little corner hasn't gone anywhere Because I like to glue base, I would actually glue a little in this corner first and heat set that to make sure that it's really not going anywhere and it's laying flat. But if you don't glue base, that's fine. It's still the same process. Like I said, that corner worked out really nicely the first time, but say for example, after you do your first press, then you come over here and maybe it's just not lining up and you're getting frustrated. I think the tendency is to just say that it's not lining up and you give up. But I would encourage you to take your time and have some patience, because you want the fabric. Someone told me when I first started quilting to be the boss of your fabric. Make your fabric do what you want it to. And that can really be said for corners, because when they don't line up, take your time, crease that fabric, and then lay it flat. If it doesn't lay in the nice miter that you want, then open it up, reposition it, and do it again until you're happy with that fabric. And like I said, if you think about it in the sense of folding a piece of paper, then sometimes it's a little bit easier. Let's go to another corner. I'll do the same thing, putting my finger in and just really making sure that that's lying flat. I'm counting on one of these corners won't be perfect because I never get 4 perfect corners. I usually get 1 or 2 and then have to fiddle with another 2. So we've pressed that side and then we want to fold this down. And you know, there's a little bit of the bump of the fabric here, and that's something that we can adjust with our finger. And then again, fold that down. Now look, that is not a nice mitered corner. See what I mean? So I just encourage you to work with it and then use your iron when you find it in a good place. Fold it down and make it where you want it to be. That looks much better. So I'm going to go ahead and heat set that. And then, as I mentioned, you'll fold it back exactly how you want it and then put a wonder clip to hold it there. And then do that on all of your corners. And so, as I mentioned, I think the most important thing when mitering corners, not only getting everything sewn correctly, because that is essentially setting you up to have the fabric here to fold down to miter appropriately. If you don't have this done on the front side first, you're never going to get those corners crisp and at an angle like you want, because you haven't set yourself up by attaching the fabric. So that's the first key. The second key, take your time, be patient, make that fabric do what you want it to. Take one side at a time. As I mentioned, use your iron, because that is creasing that fabric and making it lie flatter, and then folding it back down. And, you know, here again, I said, you know, it's a little bit of a bump, so I may work inside of that. I don't particularly like to cut those corners. Some people will recommend that. I don't think it's necessary. I think it holds that structure there, but make it lie where you want it to. And fold it, press it as you need to. And then, like I said, approach it like a piece of paper. Look how much better that looked after I pressed it. And then just press it again. Look how much better that looks now. So I would encourage you, as I mentioned, try these tips and then be patient and see what works for you.